everyone. I'm very glad to be here, back to Alma Mater after a couple of years of absence. And so far we've been talking about values, value change, value transmission, differences between generations, and I will be talking about identity, but also about change and differences across generations, more or less. As the title you can see here, the three facets of national identity, identity dynamics, and attitudes towards immigrants in Russia. And I would like to start with why I think Russia is a super interesting case for studying attitudes towards immigrants. We've also mentioned the collapse of the USSR like 5 times today, and I'll mention it again. It's especially relevant when we are looking into attitudes towards immigrants because we have a case, a country where people went from virtually no immigration to the country to one of the top 5 countries in the world by the absolute number of immigrants. This is the number for 2012, I think, and it's been relatively stable. It's around 11.7 million right now. So there was a very, very rapid change, and also people had to basically develop a new identity going from a Soviet person into a Russian person. And this makes it very interesting to look into national identity and attitudes towards immigrants specifically in Russia. And probably it's not very surprising that attitudes towards immigrants here are quite negative. For example, the Center has measured agreement with this slogan, Russia is for ethnic Russians, across several years, and they find that people support the statement, more than half of the Russian population supports the statement over and over again, and then the numbers do not really change. And also there are some studies published on ESS data that show that Russia has the second worst average attitudes towards immigrants among 29 countries that were included in the survey. And in our data that we use here, which is International Social Survey Program, this is the latest available wave, we also find that in among more than 30 countries included in the ISSP data, Russia also scores second lowest in terms of attitudes towards immigrants. So attitudes are negative. There is something to study. It's an interesting context, and of course there were already some attempts to do this, mainly sociological. There are some very, very nice papers published by Lusine Grigoyan, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but I hope, Bahi and others. And what they show is that the regular socio-demographic variables that usually predict quite well attitudes towards immigrants in other countries do not really work well in Russia. And this is just one example from a study by Identiti and colleagues where they looked at 2 different measures of attitudes towards immigrants, how people think immigrants affect culture and economics in the country. And they find that in case of Russia, socioeconomic variables that indicate status like income, education, occupation, they predict only about 2 to 3% of variance in attitudes, as opposed to other countries where on average they predict about 10% of variance. So something is different in Russian context. We can't really predict attitudes well with the status indicators. And for example, Lusine suggested that this might be happening because attitudes, anti-immigrant sentiments in Russia are quite normalized, they are quite popular, and maybe we should be looking not at socio-demographic indicators, but at psychological characteristics of people in order to predict those attitudes. And of course, I'm coming from a psychological background, so social identity is my answer to everything that is related to intergroup relations. And here we are looking at national identity, which is the type of social identity that links best to attitudes towards immigrants. And specifically, we do know that national identity is a complex thing. It has different manifestations, different ways to show and to be attached to your nation. And this is what we are doing. We are trying to look at different ways of identifying with a nation and how they relate to attitudes towards immigrants. How we do this, we use representative samples of the Russian population. This is International Social Survey Program National Identity Model from 3 time points. It's 1995, 2003, and 2013. Luckily for us, there is a quite good and extensive scale for both national identity and attitudes that was repeated in all those waves, so we have comparable data. We would like to look into a more, to get a more nuanced picture of the relationships between facets of national identity and attitudes, and to check the robustness of those effects across time. And we would like to see whether there are any changes in terms of mean scores when we look at different ways of identifying with a nation and at attitudes towards immigrants. Now, some theory behind this. I mentioned the word facets, I mentioned the word manifestations, ways of identifying. What do I mean with this? So, in psychology, we understand attachment as something neutral to positive, so there is nothing bad in identifying with social groups, and it's needed, it's necessary, we will always do identify with social groups. But when it comes to national identity, because this is such a politicized way of identifying with a social group, people always try to disentangle the good and evil ways of identifying with a nation. And this started actually probably with Adorno's genuine and white patriotism that was back in the 50s. And this is a model that is used probably most frequently, both in psychology and sociology, the distinction between nationalism and patriotism. And there are, I would say, 3 main criteria that differentiate those 2 forms of identification. Nationalism is a way of identifying that includes comparison with other nations and a feeling of superiority attached to it. So I do believe that my country is better than other countries. I think that people everywhere should be like us, etc., etc. And second and half criteria is an uncritical view of the nation, of the country. So being able to criticize your national group and do not compare it to others, and do not thinking that it's superior to others, would mean that you identify more through patriotic way of identification. So comparison, superiority, and uncritical view of the nation are the things that differentiate between nationalism and patriotism. But this is not the only way how we can separate different ways of identifying. Another differentiation was suggested by here. Actually, it relates to Smith's civic and ethnic ideas of nationhood for identification. Basically, in this case, we're talking about national pride, so you can be proud of things that are about culture, about your cultural group. It can be the history, it can be the literature, it can be all the achievements that this cultural group has had in the past. And it can be pride in political institutions, political organization of the country. So I would say that the second distinction is more often used in sociology and the first in psychology, but there is no real strong differentiation in there. It's quite intermixed. What we do here, we try to combine those 2. So basically national pride, because it does not have this comparative assumption in it, it basically can be equated with patriotism. They are essentially the same thing. And many studies measure patriotism for national pride. So what we suggest here is a 3-component structure, and these are not different identities, but these are different ways of manifesting your attachment. That would be nationalism, cultural patriotism, which would be basically the same as nation cultural in Here's model, and political patriotism. And I've actually tried this before on a small, convenient sample of Russians earlier. It worked, and yeah, that would be a good idea to try it on a representative sample and see whether the structure holds. The hypothesis, so coming back to attitudes towards immigrants, what we expect here is that nationalism, of course, because it's such a clearly bad form of identifying with a nation. It involves the feeling of superiority. It involves then critical view of the nation. We expect a negative association with attitudes towards outgroups, in this case immigrants. With political patriotism, this is tricky, but we do expect a positive relationship, and I'll explain why. First, when we look at what political patriotism actually means, basically it means that people are happy with whatever the country is doing right now. So they are satisfied with political institutions, they're proud of them, and this is this general underlying satisfaction could link political patriotism to attitudes towards immigrants. And another potential mechanism that can produce this positive link is the reduced threat. And there are some studies that show that if people believe that the state is well protected and we are not threatened by outsiders, etc., then they have more positive attitudes towards immigrants. And political patriotism is sort of an indication that people do believe that everything is going well, we are a strong country, we can protect ourselves, etc. And I did find this positive association before in the convenience sample I mentioned, so I would expect to find this again with representative samples. And cultural patriotism, I expect no association, but I'll come back to this when I present the results because there are also things to discuss here. For now, I'll go forward to wrap up the intro part. Besides testing these three hypotheses that I just showed, we also look whether this three-component structure replicates on all three waves of the study. We check the mean scores and whether they change over the time. We have almost 20 years in between the first and the last measures. And finally, we check whether the associations between the tests of national identity and attitudes towards immigrants are stable across time. So a bit more about the data. It's representative samples from 1,500 to 2,300. And yeah, I don't think this is probably many of you know anyway this data, so I won't focus on that. How we measure things, so we had 5 items measuring attitudes towards immigrants, and these are all more or less classical items for those kind of scales. An example would be immigrants increase crime rates. National identity, so we had measures for all three facets. And for nationalism, these are 5 items that indicate belief in superiority of one's nation over others. For example, generally speaking, Russia is a better country than most other countries. And for uncritical approach, there was an item that even if the country is doing something wrong, we should still support it. For political patriotism, also 5 items, and people needed to indicate how proud they are in different things, like democracy, like fair and equal treatment of different groups in the society, etc. And for cultural patriotism, these are mainly cultural achievements, like arts and literature, and history and sports, and things like that. Control variables, say education, social status, support for the regime. This sounds scary. This simply means that people either voted or were planning to vote for the ruling party. So whoever was whoever was leading at the moment of the survey was quoted as 1 and all others as 0, just to control whether political views could eliminate some of the effects that we had here. Actually, we also looked at gender and religiosity, but they were not correlated with attitudes, so we did not include them in the final analysis. What we did here, so first of all, we looked at CPAs, multiple comparisons, to see whether the overall structure works well in all 3 time points. We checked for invariances to be able to compare the mean scores across time. And we looked at structural equation models to check the associations and to check the robustness of those associations. So I'll start with the structure. I won't go into too much detail about the CFA and invariances, etc., just telling you that it worked well. The only modification that was made, we deleted one item from nationalism scale that was about sports, feeling proud when Russia is doing well in sports, and it was very strongly correlated with cultural patriotism, which makes sense because it's also about sports. There is an item about sports. So that was basically the only change that we made to the scale, and these are the final list of items that were included in each of the constructs. And we established at least partial metric and scalar invariance for all the constructs, and including the attitudes towards immigrants construct, so we were safe to do all the mean comparisons we wanted. And here they are. Mean comparisons. So these are latent mean comparisons, and the differences here are standardized latent mean differences. I only calculated the observed mean for the first wave, so we'll have something to compare to, because usually with latent mean comparisons, the mean of the first group is fixed to 0, so we wouldn't have anything to compare to. But yeah, you can see that attitudes towards immigrants are worsening over the time, and I have to say here that, of course, the composition of who migrants were and are is changing a lot. And in the beginning of the 90s, these were mainly ethnic Russians coming back to Russia from all the former republics. And then there was more labor migration in later years. So this could have an effect on who people think of when they read immigrants. But in any case, we see that the attitudes are worsening over time. Nationalism is increasing, but not that much. The changes are quite small. And the most dramatic changes are happening with political patriotism, which is increasing rapidly. And it went from virtually non-existent to fairly good level, with medium level. And cultural patriotism was the only thing that did not change at all. So people were quite proud of Russian culture before, and they are still quite proud of it, which is a good thing. And these are the changes that we are observing. Now, more importantly, what are the relationships between those things? So we can see the standardized weights in the parentheses, and as we expected, nationalism had a robust relationship with attitudes in all three waves. Political patriotism, the same. Positive association, as hypothesized, also didn't change over the time. And cultural patriotism had a surprise for us here in the third wave. There is a negative association that wasn't there before, which is interesting. And I promised you to come back to cultural patriotism when I was presenting the theoretical model, because cultural patriotism is a tricky thing and a bit dangerous. Because it's a very normal thing. We all are proud of the cultures we come from, at least to some extent. It's a very normal thing to have. The problem with it is that it's a more exclusionist form of attachment if you compare it to political patriotism. Linking it back to civic and ethnic forms of attachment or conceptions of nationhood. If nation is defined by citizenship, by people who live in this territory, people who obey the laws of this country, people who respect our institutions, etc. This would be all related to political patriotism. If nationhood is defined through common history, common language, common culture, these are all the things that you either need to be born in the country or you need to live in the country for quite a long time to really immerse yourself into that culture. So it's much harder to become a part of a culture if culture is defined as a nation. If nation is defined through these cultural terms and cultural ways. And I think that there are also some studies that show that patriotism is much more context dependent than nationalism, and it can change its effects depending on what is happening around. And I think what we are observing here might be, I don't know, it's speculation, but might have something to do with how culture was politicized in the beginning of 2000s. So the last wave is 2013. And in the beginning of 2000s, was the anniversary of the victory in the Second World War. It was the preparations for Olympics started, so there was a lot of discussion about this cultural things around, and they were linked to the notions of superiority, more or less. So I think this negative association might have appeared at this time point because how the discussion around cultural things were happening here. But it's only speculation. I'm not sure, but what is important in terms of contribution, you can see the R squares there, and this is the model without the control variables, and just to show you what national identity can explain alone. And it alone can explain from 6 to 18% of variance. And if you remember, I showed at the beginning that sociodemographic variables, socioeconomic variables could predict only 2 to 3%. So yes, psychological characteristics work much better in predicting attitudes, at least in this context, but I would argue that in other contexts as well. I do not present here the results with the control variables. They were largely the same, so the effects remain there. And all the control variables together added, again, 2 to 3% of variance, so these were my stronger predictors. And to finish, the structure was replicated, and I would guess it's not specific to Russia. There are some preliminary indications for this. For example, Fabrikant and Magun found that in the overall sample of ISSP, they could also see this distinction between different forms of national pride, and nationalism is always going, of course, in its own way. So this would be something to look at later. We could see that nationalism, political patriotism, and anti-immigrant attitudes are increasing over time, and political patriotism showed the most dramatic changes of all. And of course, nationalism was related to more negative, and political patriotism to more positive attitudes. But the most interesting finding for me here is that, yes, political patriotism does have this positive effect. It was very surprising when I found it first, because being proud of how democracy in Russia works, of equal and fair treatment of all groups, if you look at the data, Russians are not satisfied with the democracy in the country. They do not believe it's really there. So why pride in those things should lead to more positive attitudes? But the more, the more I looked into the literature around it, the more sense it makes, because there are some alternative explanations. So the usual explanation is that this pride in political things is about appreciation of democratic values, but there are also some indications that it might not be only that or just that, but also some general level of satisfaction or reduced threat could have something to do with this. And this is it. I will, just conclude with a political statement, I guess. Not really, but I think this is true for any and every country in the world, that promoting non-comparative ways of identifying with the state focused on development rather than the notions of superiority is necessary to have harmonious relations in the country. And I think looking into this more fine-grained ways of identifying is a good way to show that this is important. And to end with something positive, friendship of nations. I'd say thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. We can take, before we give Chris the word, we can take 2 or 3 questions.
possible to use this three-component model in the case of Tatars in Tatarstan, in the case of traditional ethnic minorities in Russia?
I think it's possible to use for everyone if you are interested in identification with the state, with Russia state. And if you believe that all ethnic groups have certain level of are immersed into the Russian culture to some extent, then you could measure it. I'm not sure it would be as informative as with the dominant group in the country, but it would be interesting to look at it at least. Like, I don't see why it can't be measured. I'm not 100% sure whether it will be very informative in terms of predicting other things.
Yes, right.
You mentioned this great number of immigrants recently. So what is the distribution in terms of geographical region or nationality? So
Where they're coming from.
Where are they coming from?
These are mainly former USSR countries. So it's predominantly, well, Eastern Europe, it's Ukraine and Moldova. From the south, it's Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And from the Central Asia, it's mainly Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. So I think like the vast majority are the former USSR republics.
Previously, was that the case that previously they came but they were not considered immigrants because they were citizens of the Soviet Union?
Yeah.
So is this a question of definition or really the migration changed?
It's a really good question because I think both. Because yes, they weren't really considered immigrants because they were not. Also, they're, but also, after the status changed, people had to create these boundaries. People had to start identifying with the nation, with a new nation, and start building this group borders to put someone outside. But at the same time, the immigration in the 90s looked very different from how it looks now. In the beginning of 90s, these were mainly Russians ethnic Russians coming back to Russia. And then with time, the more country developed, the more economically successful it became, the more labor migrants started coming in, and so both are true.
So,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
just, I like this very much. One idea, and to be a bit sarcastic about, I'm from the United States, and we have, our president has an immigration view that has been characterized, but if you could quantify it, I think, in the sense of, if you took, rather than attitudes, say measures of educational achievement in Russia versus the migrants. And so you get some vague measure of cultural coming into the group. Is it a higher level of achievement from the immigrants or a lower level of achievement? So it's kind of looking at it as optimal group size. You want a member of your group to be less educated than the existing group or more educated. And as you were saying, that group changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and the same with the political, there's measures, independent measures of political democracy, the polity measures. So if you had some so-called objective measures rather than attitudes, you could get some sense of focusing in on the nationalism attitude more. So it would be a way to complement it or to compare the Russian figures with the figures of the immigrants to say it's not only the levels, it's the differences between.
You mean, I'm not sure I'm getting, you mean who the immigrants are?
Yeah. So, and to go to President Trump's extremely rude, he wants immigrants to come from the Scandinavian countries.
I heard.
So, but you could either dismiss that, but you could quantify it in some sense as what is the cultural level or the educational level in migrants over time has changed, and given the groups have changed, and how did that affect things?
Yeah, that probably would be possible. Well, I do have only, if I understood you correctly, if we look at the composition of immigrants at each time point, we could actually check whether this was the main
And
cause
use
for.
some objective measures like educational achievement
Yeah.
or their scores.
Yeah.
and stuff, right?
Yeah, that would be very nice. The only problem is that we have only 3 time points, so it would be a bit difficult to be sure whether this is the explanation. But yeah, it would be definitely worth at least to look at the descriptive statistics and see whether they follow different things.
I also have a question, and Lucy, forgive me for, it's embarrassing to praise somebody who's affiliated to the two institutions I'm also affiliated, and who's at the same time also my doctoral advisee. I would like to, therefore would like to ask a critical question on your structure equation model there, because it of course raises points that will probably maybe also come from Chris. Now, going back to your where you state your analytic approaches, yes, that one. So what you do here is you do something where Chris, I guess, at least from the abstract lashed out between countries, you do that between time points. You do multi-group confirmatory factor analysis for the 3 time points. This, of course, then tests continuity in the old methodological terminology across time. Then you then come to other questions. Now, when you now please go back to your structural equation model, what I miss in your study is, why don't you report the correlations between the three? Because I would guess they have changed. I would think that posing equality constraints on these will not fit. I think what you will have is that cultural patriotism moved closer to nationalism. So, which in a certain sense invalidates your 3-component model, because if that becomes across time becomes one thing, then of course, yeah, because I had a lot of sympathy for your positive negative. There is of course a publication of mine that you could cite there, but that's not the point. I think it is a very important thing. Sorry, I'm not the discussant, but I also would support your view in using some well, what sociologists, political scientists typically call controls in some objective. Because in principle, one could, of course, scold you for explaining attitudes by attitudes. You have attitudes to the nation and attitudes to immigrants. And I think it would help your models greatly if you were saying, including some indicators on the individual level, I agree, that are somehow objectifying what the social context is and whether it has changed. Now, I almost commented a little instead of asking the question, but what are the correlations?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't know why I decided to not put them here, but I got exactly the same criticism from the reviewers when we submitted this first, and I also thought that cultural patriotism would come closer to nationalism with time, but what we found is that they do not change at all. So the correlations remain stable in all 3 time points. They are relatively weak, so they are all around 0.3, and these are not the same things. They do not even exceed 0.5 to even think that they could be the same thing. And also they do support the more broader distinction between nationalism and patriotism, because these two correlate a bit stronger with each other than each of them with nationalism. So it all seems to be working out as it's supposed to be working out. And about the objective socioeconomic indicators, I did not look at them in terms of who the immigrants were in this time point, but I did have controls in the model. And I can show you the overall table that I did not include there. So I did check also gender and religiosity, and both of them were uncorrelated with attitude, so I did not include them here, but we did have age education, social status, and well, support for the ruling party or president. And yeah, they did add some explained variance. For example, we had about 9% here, and here we have 12. It was 6% explained by national identity, and it's 9% together with the controls, and that was 18%, and now it's 20%. So they do add some, but they are clearly not the most important predictors, at least in this context, in the Russian context.
Okay, I would stop the questions of the Q&A session and would now ask Chris to discuss the two pictures. Tatiana, maybe you want to stay there? I don't know, but I presume we have the chronological order. Chris, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to comment on these two papers, both of which are interesting in very different ways, of course. So there's not so much thematic overlap, so I will not try to make any artificial syntheses here, but try to go through both papers each separately, and I'm going to start with Tatiana's contribution, which I found extremely interesting because it's a nice comparative setting. You could actually sell it as a difference in difference design, where you have the cohort differences on the one hand embedded in the differences between the countries. And I also found the results that you have rather plausible and quite credible. There's just a couple of things that have crossed my mind where I thought, like, here you could give it a little bit more additional thought. So we are playing mostly on the difference between majority and minority status, which means you put Latvia and Azerbaijan into the same box. For some reasons, this is of course understanding, but I also thought I saw some subtle differences between Latvia and Azerbaijan that would make it worthwhile to think more conceptually what that difference might be. And Edward's comment was with the socioeconomic status was going a little bit in the direction. I think the relative positions of the Russians to the Azerbaijanis is different than the relative positions of the Russians to the Latvians in Latvia. And not only in socioeconomic status, I also think in cultural terms. And this is something we need to think about. One issue is just the cultural distance. You could look at the ESS and look at the average values. Where are the Latvians on some of these value measures compared to the Russians there, and the same for Azerbaijan. And you would see how distant are the two groups, and you would get a sense of what is the absolute distance. Maybe there's already something different between Azerbaijan and Latvia as how the Russians are positioned. But the other, maybe even more important factor is the direction of the difference. My hunch would be in Azerbaijan, the Russians are culturally more progressive than the Azerbaijani population, whereas in Latvia it would turn to be the other way around, that the Russians there are culturally more conservative than the Latvians. So this is just one, just assumption that you could have.
Get the chance to respond.
If it could be the other way around, you get my point. The question is, would it make a difference if the Russians are relatively more conservative or relatively more progressive to the surrounding population where they are in? And can we theorize about that, what that would mean? My hypothesis would be, if Russian minority is placed in a population where the Russians are the more conservative ones, that could be a factor that creates a more seclusive, protective attitude that would encourage conservation, in which case I would probably expect the acculturation process to be slower, and that would mean cohort differences being smaller. You could come up with a lot of other arguments. I'm just saying I would think a little bit more in this direction and come up with a couple of hypotheses on how this relative cultural position might impact on the acculturation process. The other comment I have is when you saw some of these line graphs, you could see differences in intercept, but also differences in slope, which is the slope differences are about the pace of acculturation, intercept differences are about where the starting points or the trajectories, how much different they remain. And I think these are two separate aspects that need separate conceptualization and thinking about it. And I think I would come up with different hypotheses for slope differences and another set of hypotheses for intercept differences. And then it gets a bit more nuanced and complex. But I mean, of course, this is all you can build on this what you have here. Coming to Lucy, also very inspiring and interesting paper. I probably, as always, had some quibbles with some of the terminology and the labeling, but don't want to go into that much. What I thought would have been worthwhile an attempt when you think about the varieties of nationalism. I would see, theoretically speaking, two dimensions of variation. You bring them out, but I would cross-tabulate them. The two key ones for me would be suprematist versus non-suprematist nationalism, and the other one would be, you mentioned that, civic versus ethnic. And then you get a fourfold matrix, and then you can create a typology. My hunch would be they are actually not two-dimensional. I would assume that ethnic goes easily together with suprematist, and so that two of these quadrants are filled probably more easily than the others, but that would help to get the logical matrix a little bit better organized, and then from there thinking about how you combine your indicators. Just an idea that crossed my mind. Then the one concept that bugged me a little bit was the political patriotism, because in the beginning when you explained it, I thought like, oh, she's actually describing a very positive civic mindedness in the country. But then I saw the indicators, and you say like, democracy works good in our country, and then I was wondering, what type of patriotism is it when a Russian says he is extremely happy about how democracy works in the country when it does not? And doesn't this tell us the person is happy because there is not democracy? So that might be counterintuitive. It might actually indicate a happy authoritarian sense, and that Putin is driving the country into in the right direction, providing more law and order and more draconian laws and strict rule. And then I would not be sure if that would be political patriotism for me. So this is, but I mean, the concept as such is okay, I think. Just the labeling is a little bit, let's say, one can think about it a little bit more. And then the most interesting and puzzling thing is that you really have a puzzle here. The big elephant in the room that you have is you see in your structural equation modeling that the impact of political patriotism is increasing over time. And the impact is positive. Keep that in mind. The impact of political patriotism is positive, so more a welcoming attitude towards immigrants. So this is increasing over time. And the mean level of political patriotism is increasing over time as well. If you take those two pieces of information and ask anyone, what would you expect to be the time series evidence for attitudes towards immigrants? The conclusion would be it should become better, but it becomes worse. I think this is a classic example for the macro puzzle, where you see something on the individual level where it would not intuitively match what you see on the aggregate level. And this is something you have to wrap your mind around, because you're not really offering a solution for that. And I think for me it's a very obvious thing that makes that case extremely interesting. my suspicion would be that something with salience is going on, and you might probe into a little bit more of interaction effects between some variables. Maybe there's some moderation stories going on here and other stuff. But this is something that I would be really curious to see how you resolve that the temporal evidence is increasing xenophobia, but the predictors that predicted the most are positive predictors, and they increased in explanatory power and in the mean level. So that's something quite positive.
Thanks.
These are my 5 cents.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, very much. But our two presenters, of course, get the replication opportunity. No. That's bad English. But
One comment
go ahead, Tanya.
about the fact that Russians are more conservative than Latvians. It is not true, I think, because if we remember those who settled in Latvia after World War II, they were more educated, they were city dwellers, in comparison with the Latvians who lived in villages. And more educated people, I think, and those who live in cities might have a lower level of conservation.
After 1991, the position of ethnic Russians in Latvia and Estonia has deteriorated, even though they especially in Latvia, had good background. It sort of changed a lot.
The level of education haven't changed.
Yeah, but even if you have a college education, but you can't make a living, and you are forced to get money by prostitution. No. There was an interesting study that in Riga, where Russians make just over 50%. Within the population of prostitutes, 20% were ethnic Russian. So, and this is not because Russians have preferences for this type of but simply because of their socioeconomic situation that drastically deteriorated after 1991.
But it is not a sign of their conservation.
Yes. It's a sign of openness.
Openness to change. Self-transfer.
Yeah, but what I mean on a classic Engelhardt logic, that what Edward just said would mean that the Russians are more on a survival value position, and that means rather.
Russians in Russia.
Sorry.
Russians in Russia.
Well, the theory says if you're living under existential threat and anxiety, then on a scale from survival to self-expression, how does you move to the survival end?
Yes, we know it.
To me, this controversy also points to what you said in the very beginning, but maybe in a very complex way. I think one needs to include in the individual data somehow the position of people to the context in which they live.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Be it include social indicators, but be it also in if you for example create kind of an indicator between the Latvian average or the Latvian average for certain social strata on certain values. I think this would make it much more understandable what you find there, because of course I also thought your findings are all very plausible, but I also have a hard time explaining them. If you could, for example, rule out what Chris's hunch is, then of course your presentation would benefit a lot, because also what Marta said, I was also on the doctoral committee of a Latvian who made a qualitative study about Latvian national identity, and and Russians and as said, for most Russians, citizenship is not a possibility in Latvia. Yeah, it's not
Yes, but
completely,
how
but
can you
it's-
contribute
Yeah.
with your highly educated mind to the society in 100% way if you are not a citizen?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
and
basically
and
exclusion
you
from
need
the
to,
society.
I think you need to somehow capture this in the quantitative data that are available somewhere in data archives as reference points. I think this would greatly benefit the strength of your argumentation.
Tatiana herself is Lithuanian Russian, and so she knows the situation inside. In
Yeah, sure, sure.
Three Baltic states.
I'm just pushing also what Chris said of putting this into the analysis somehow. The local knowledge, the reference points of certain things, and if you're sure that Chris's allegations are wrong, the best way to show he's wrong is using data. Yeah, and in the sense that you said in the very beginning of social indicators that you relate to.
If your existence is threatened, it's not only survival values, but you go back to your tradition. I mean,
Exactly. That's what
you see that if your national identity is a Russian in this
that's
country,
an anchor.
exactly, then you really stick to it, and that increases this kind of
But because
using
there
just
are many in Latvia, they are politically active. For example, they struggle for education in Russian for their children, and they are not passive victims of the situation. They have agents to struggle.
exactly, but then you
Yes.
have to strengthen all these kind
Yes,
of traditions.
but they have any linguistic vitality and try to conserve their identity.
Lucy, would you also want to back comment?
Maybe very briefly, because it's. Should I comment on everything or try to be short?
We have another 9 minutes.
Okay. I really like the idea with the 2 dimensions and cross-tabulation, basically not what I did, just combining them into a single line of different things, but
You might still end up empirically with one dimension, because it's just the diagonal in the fourfold matrix that is sort of filled, and you would still have a justification for your. But I thought it would be a better organizing frame.
yeah, I was thinking I could look into latent classes or something like that. That could be interesting as a next step. But what I want to comment on most is the political patriotism increasing and attitudes going down. There are several things. The first thing is that all forms or all manifestations of national identification are interrelated, and we see the positive effects when we control for nationalism. So every part of the model might have a piece of nationalism attached to it, but because we control for it in the model, we do get these positive associations because they all are about identification. They all might have something to do with nationalism. That's the first thing, and the second thing, we still predict only or explain only, well, we talk about political patriotism, probably it's something around 3% of variance, and then there is the 97% that we do not explain. So we cannot really say that we should see the trends following this direction if we do not have everything in the model to account for all the changes. And the final thing is that the composition.
I have never seen someone taking the non-explained variance as a defense of a model, but that is really smart.
But I mean, it's true. Like, can we expect?
No, sure. It's a very smart way to turn things around.
It's true. Okay, sorry. Yeah, the last thing is that who the immigrants are has also changed. So we might see this decrease not because of the changes in national identification or the ways of national identification, but because who the immigrants are is very different. And a very smart comment on the political patriotism. I had exactly the same reaction as you when I first saw that people who believe, who are proud of how democracy in Russia works are more positive towards immigrants. I was like, who these people are? Why they would be proud? What's going on? And we do know, like I did look at the World Values Survey, they do not think that the democracy is a reality. They don't think that. And still the ones who are proud are more positive. Mm-hmm. But the more I looked into the literature, the more it made sense, because also this paper by Fabricant and Magunda I cited, they show that the political patriotism or political pride, let's say, everywhere, they look across countries and they look at the country level indicators, it is associated with higher GDP per capita, with higher human development index, with all the good things. And we did have development in Russia, right? People do live better than they lived before. So even though this might not be a reality, still people's lives did improve over the years. And they are more satisfied with how things are because it's subjective reality. The lives did improve. So either the satisfaction with their life, with the basic things that they have the opportunity to have nowadays, or the feeling that the country is doing better in terms of it's more secure, we have more political power, whatever. We are not as threatened as we were before. Both of those things could be associated both with the political patriotism and with attitudes towards immigrants. So, yeah, I think there is a mechanism that could link these two to each other. I don't know if you're convinced, but...
No, I think it was important for me, at least, that you pointed to the fact that we all could see that this blatant nationalism is parceled in this model, because you did not have a second order factor, but you said you have three different components, so they're all partial for each other. So you have a core that is not blatant nationalism, that has and of course, as we all know, even beyond the political science or the social psychology, we have this private discussion on constitutional patriotism by Habermas, and so in this idea is something that is also in political philosophy, and so yeah, I think it's a point that could very well be pursued. Do we have final words? No, final questions. Yes.
Maybe a quick one, if I may. When I did a study of Arab countries and particularly gender attitudes and attitudes toward democracy, I found out that many people in the Arab countries understood democracy in a very special way. They thought that Saudi Arabia was a democracy, many of them, and it's an absolute monarchy, no political parties, no elections, just because this is a country with a high living standard. And so when I think about that, and what you said about political patriotism, maybe these are people who feel that life is getting better, the country is going in the right direction, they are more secure with their own position than party, and this is why this kind of feeling correlates with a more positive attitude towards migrants, because if you feel secure about your position within the country, then it's just the economic. The economic paper with Veronica, right? Yeah, and also Fabricant who is presenting tomorrow.
I did try actually to look at the mediation through social status, but it did not explain all of it. So the mediation was there, but it did not explain explain all of the effect. It's partly about the status, but there is something else going on, and threat, like at the country level, might be also related. Thanks.
Yes, I think we have a point landing, as some people say. We have closed our session 2 minutes before its formal ending. The bell has not rung yet, and thank you for coming and contributing to the 2 sessions. And well, we'll see you again at another time, and thank you very much.